And I'm going to be taking this last session with the support of Rhiannon. My name's Carmel Conn and I'm based at the University of South Wales. So we're going to be looking at this last session at the issue of changing practices in education and thinking about how we can support that. So I'm just going to get up my slides, which I think have already been shared with you, hopefully. I actually haven't shared them in the chat. So hopefully everyone can see that. Is that okay? Yeah, thank you. So what we're going to be looking at in this last hour and a half is this issue of change. Now, just to say to begin with that change in education is far from a straightforward issue, as you probably know. It's often conceptualized in the literature as a sort of simple case of cause and effect, you know, that if you do this to somebody, this is going to happen. But as you probably also know, that is actually rarely the case. Because in actual fact, in education, what we're dealing with is we're dealing with lots and lots of variables that are operating. We're dealing with a human factor, so we're dealing with human beings who bring a richness to any kind of interaction and relationship and make contexts really, really important. We're also dealing with interdependencies within the system, so a kind of back and forthness in terms of any kind of action and response to it. There's a kind of two-way process within educational processes and change. There's a kind of feedback and feed forward element to what goes on. Now, what we're also thinking about this afternoon, of course, is inclusive education. And as you probably also know, this is also far from a straightforward area. As Jonathan was saying earlier, you know, it's a very complex area. It involves lots of different layers. And probably what we need to be really thinking about in particular, in relation to this particular topic, is that inclusion is very much not just about practice or what people do, actions, but it's also about values and people's beliefs and people's prior experiences and cultures that operate. So these kind of quite amorphous things, which are nevertheless incredibly powerful. And it's also about often working not yourself in a particular way, but encouraging others to work in particular ways. So I'm thinking there about, for example, the role of the ALN or other kind of people who are operating more of a leadership position in this area. So what we're thinking about this afternoon is we're definitely thinking about complexity, and we're thinking about ways of working with complexity. So we're going to be focusing on core strand 4 from the learning materials on PebblePad. That's on both of the substrands. So one of the substrand looks at theories of change, and the other substrand looks at how we can engage practitioners in this particular issue of change in relation to inclusive education. As I say, we're going to kind of be thinking about the work of the Elenco, because obviously that's a very important role in this area, but also we're thinking about the practice of class teachers and other people within a setting. So the aims of this session is to identify some of the key processes that support change for inclusion, what research tells us about those, and evaluate these in relation to your own professional practice. We're going to be putting you into some breakout rooms for this session as well. We're also going to ask you to reflect upon effective practices that support professional learning in this area and that could bring about change. And finally, we're going to think at the very end about the professional standards for teaching leadership and how these might support change in relation to inclusion. So just thinking now, first of all, about substrand 1. Excuse me, I've got a fog in my throat. So in PebblePad and the learning materials, you were introduced to some two general theories of change management. But in this session, and what these do, so kind of what's valuable about these is that they try to combine and consider micro-level interactions with macro-level structures and processes that exist within an organization. So that's obviously very important for education and for classroom practice, which is very much about what people do at the within the classroom, at the chalk face, I was going to say, but that's a very old term now, and how that relates to kind of wider systems and structures that they're part of. That's a very, very important factor within education. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is I'm going to introduce you to another theory of change and or framework for change, and that's been particularly designed for inclusive education, and which you may have come across. So we're going to consider that a little bit more. But before that, I just want to say something very briefly about two things. One is about the role of the Elenco, and the other thing is about what research tells us in this area about kind of what supports change. So I think one thing that I want to highlight about the role of the Elenco is how much this role is about collective agency. So the Elenco pretty much never really acts in terms of their own agency in relation to people outcomes. They almost always act through other people and with other people. It's very much, that's kind of what it's described in the literature as this mediator role, that it's a role where somebody brings others together and thinks together about practice and change practices. So that's a really kind of important thing to bear in mind, but also the complexity of that. Rather than just being able to take action yourself, what you're doing is you're trying to kind of encourage, support others to act in certain ways and perhaps change their practice in certain ways. Elencos take on different roles. I mean, this is something that we looked at in previous modules, I know, but Elencos act in different ways with different groups of people, and they also always pretty much base their work on social processes within their setting. So interactions with other people, talking and reflection, making observations and thinking about what's going on. But it's kind of like this social process that Elencos need to work with in order to bring about more inclusive practice and kind of more pupil progress. That's what they're sort of seeking to support. Now, the other thing that I want to bring up as a kind of preface to what we're going to think about is this research by Alan Rouse, which was done some time ago now in 2008, but is still very influential in this area. And what he found, he looked at kind of what processes actually support change in relation to inclusion. And what he found was that actually what's really important with inclusive education is not what people know and not what people do, although those things are really important. But also there's this third process, which is people's belief systems, what people believe about what they do. It also really is really and crucially important. And what he also found is that change takes place in any one of those areas. So if somebody changes in terms of what they know about their practice, about an individual pupil, about something that they're doing, or if somebody changes in terms of what they believe, so what they believe about the learner or what they believe about themselves as a teacher, or what they believe about the learning situation, or something changes in terms of what somebody does, that results in change in both of the other two areas. So there's a kind of overall change within that system of individual action. And what Alan Rouse's research findings really highlighted was the importance of belief in this area. So it's kind of like that inclusion is not just about acting, and it's not just about knowing, it's not about specialist knowledge, for example, but it's also very much about people's belief systems. And frameworks that have been developed since then, and one that we're going to look at very much focuses on this issue of people's belief systems. Now, what I'm going to introduce you to, you might be familiar with it already because it's extremely well known. It's called the EiP, or the Inclusive Pedagogical Approach in Action Framework. It's developed by Lanny Florian, and it's been very influential in Scotland and has supported the development of kind of inclusive practices and a national framework for inclusion in Scotland. I'm going to show it to you in a minute, but I'm just going to say something about where it kind of originates from. So Lanny Florian's work is very much influenced, and what's been going on in Scotland actually is very much influenced by the earlier work of Susan Hart and Mary Drummond, people like that, Christine Black Hawkins. I think some of these people that are on the reading list. And they carried out very influential research which looked at teachers' classroom practices and basically sort of made assessments, if you like, of what teachers do when they are inclusive. They carried out observations, and they also talked to teachers, and they found that there were certain things in place in classrooms of teachers who were particularly inclusive in their practice, and where children were very much kind of participating in the learning that was going on. And what they found was that there were three kind of principles of practice, or three areas of belief, that were particularly important. And those are the belief that everybody in a class is the responsibility of the teacher. So the teacher not thinking that they can teach some children in the class, but actually some children are not really their responsibility and it's somebody else's responsibility. So this belief in everybody. Also the belief that that inclusive practice is about co-agency, so that learners are agents and teachers are agents, and learners are sense makers. And it's important as a teacher to understand the way in which learners make sense of the world and it makes sense of their learning, and to kind of be able as a teacher to align yourself with that a little bit through assessment for learning practices generally, in order to be able to kind of understand a learner more, and also to know a little bit more about how to support them. So this kind of belief in the co-agency of learners was really important. And the third area that they found was really important was this trust that teachers, inclusive teachers, had that all learners are capable of learning. So there wasn't a belief that operated that some learners have a kind of fixed ability or a low ability. It was that actually that inclusive teachers had quite high expectations of all learners, and they had a belief that actually all learners, even though they may not be making progress, but they could make progress under the right circumstances. And this belief in trust enabled kind of the more inclusive teachers to evaluate their own practices. So rather than thinking that this is a problem of the learner, of the child or the young person, it kind of like actually highlighted to the teacher that maybe there's the learning situation, there's something not quite right about this kind of learning situation, and that it's that needs some attention and possibly some adjustment. So those those beliefs, that this idea of everybody, co-agency and trust, so this sort of beliefs that Hart and Drummond identified went on to inform what was developed in this inclusive pedagogical approach in action framework, which I'll show you now. And you can see there that on the left, it's about these kind of three areas of practice. And those areas, two of them are beliefs, and one of them, well, you could say actually all three of them really are beliefs. And then the framework looks at kind of the concepts that are associated with that and what the key challenges are, and kind of important areas of practice. But if you see by looking on the left of that diagram or the table, that actually what is focused on there is these three areas, okay? So the assumption that actually all learners learn in different ways. So this kind of a diversity as an assumption about learning. It's not that people learn in the same way, or that there's kind of fixed ways of learning or even fixed amounts of ability, but there's a kind of openness about learning and about what people are able to do in learning situations. And this is thought to be important because what research has shown, some of the research that I've just cited, but also other pieces of research as well, is that where teachers have higher expectations of learners, then learners tend to do better. So kind of more higher expectations, but also more open-ended expectations. And the reason for that is that, as you probably know as a teacher, learners often surprise us. So you might think you can anticipate how somebody's going to kind of respond to some kind of learning situation. But often what happens when you're a teacher is that actually children or young people do something that you didn't expect, or were able to do something that you didn't quite expect them to be able to do. And so this kind of open-endedness, non-deterministic, that's how Lanny Florian tends to describe it, view of learning. So the second layer of this is that a belief by practitioners that they are capable of teaching the learners in the class. So this was kind of deemed to be a really important part of this framework, that actually inclusion is not just about kind of within child or within learner factors, it's also about a process of teaching and learning, and it's about a learning relationship, and that where teachers are in terms of how they see themselves and how they see what they can do and how they can support is actually a really important factor that kind of supports whether somebody is able to learn or not. And the relationship, the learning relationship, the quality of that is often the best indicator of kind of outcomes. And that's where this second a kind of layer of belief, that's what it's about. And as you can probably gather, it's very much, again, what Jonathan was talking about this morning. It's about kind of shifting away from a kind of medical model view of learning, where learning is a sort of transmission of knowledge and understanding to the learners in a one-way process. And it's much more about a social model of learning, where it's a kind of interactive process, and it's about a two-way relationship and a kind of responsiveness in terms of teaching. And the final layer of this framework, that bottom layer there, is it concerns practitioners continually developing creative ways of working with others. So that's about the idea that teaching, and particularly teaching for inclusion, is not about fixed practices. Okay, so that's often you see in research, some forms of research, that is the way that teaching is described. It's described as the implementation of kind of ideas or practices that have been developed elsewhere, and that teachers do that with greater or lesser fidelity. That's the kind of language that's used. But actually, as those of us who've been teachers and work in teaching and education know, teaching is not about a kind of fixed practice at all. It's about adapting practices to the context that you're actually in and the learners that you're actually teaching. And it's about experimentation, and it's about trying things out. And these are seen as kind of within education documents, like, for example, in some of the reform documents that we have here in Wales, this is seen as a kind of very virtuous elements of education, that teachers make judgments, and they make professional judgments based on kind of what it is that they are dealing with in any one classroom at any one time. So I think an important part of that section is really about that. Actually, what this framework is saying is that although professional judgment is important, teachers shouldn't feel as if they are kind of making those judgments by themselves. They should always feel as if they're part of a community of practice, and that any kind of issue that they come up against in terms of teaching and learning, like a learner who's finding it hard to progress and who doesn't seem to be a kind of, or it's difficult to support, that the teacher should feel that they should be able to ask other people about that, and to be able to reflect with others and think of kind of ways forward and things to try out with other people within their school and with parents, and you know, that is this sort of shared endeavour. So this is the framework. I can actually post it in the chat. I'll do that actually when I think we go into rooms, but let me just move on because actually I'm going to ask you to think about this now. So what we're going to do is we're going to put you probably into 3 groups again. I think you're going to do that, Rhiannon, aren't you? Hope so. And I'm going to ask you to think about this framework, which I will post in the chat. And to think about it, well, to think first of all about your own settings, and to have a discussion with others in your group about what beliefs you think are operating in, what beliefs do you identify within your setting, and beliefs about learners, belief about development, belief about what teaching and learning is, and also beliefs about inclusion. So we're talking about kind of these large beliefs, because obviously those are important. And so that's the first thing to think about, is what are the kind of dominant beliefs, or what beliefs exist within your setting, would you say, around those things? And how do those relate to the descriptors in the EiP framework? So do you recognize some of those issues that are being highlighted in the EiP framework, or do you not recognize them? And probably also it would be useful to think about, you know, in terms of the beliefs that operate in your setting, ways in which those beliefs are identified, how they are engaged with, if at all, and how they are incorporated into kind of general ideas about practice, if at all. So, as a sort of preliminary to thinking about this process of change, just to think about this issue of belief within your setting and kind of how it is identified and engaged with and incorporated, if it is at all. So if I just come out of this now, and then if we go into, I'm going to give you 20 minutes, I think. What's the time? So yeah, I think I'm going to give you about 15 to 20 minutes. I'll give you a countdown and ask you to come back and feedback in your group. Now, please do remember to switch your cameras on, because it's really nice for people to engage, and there's not very many of you now. I think some people have left, so it would be really helpful if everybody in a group. We might actually just use 2 groups, I think, and then I'll call you back at about 5 past or 10 past, but I'll give you a countdown for that. Again, just talk amongst yourselves. I'm doing this slowly today, right? Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Can you see that better? Is that visible? Yeah, okay. So now what we're going to think about in this sort of second part of this session is we're going to think about the other substrand of this called strand 4, which is thinking about how to engage people. And obviously some of you have already been talking about this, but we're just going to focus on it a little bit more. Okay, so we know what change looks like, or what research tells us about change looks like, but how do we actually kind of bring about that change? Now, I actually think, and this is just kind of my own thing really, that Charles Peirce, who was a pragmatist working kind of, nearly 100 years ago, his ideas are really interesting in this area. Now, pragmatism, so that's like the work of John Dewey and the work of Charles Peirce, there's been a resurgence of interest in kind of recent educational research and practice, because their ideas about kind of keeping very much practice as the focus of theory and research, and thinking about how learning is about making meaning and the meaningfulness of kind of teaching and learning situations, and considering learning as a kind of experiential thing, and how you've kind of got to consider the learner's experience whenever you think about teaching and learning. Those sorts of ideas are very, very current at the moment. So there's been kind of like this renewed interest in the work of people like John Dewey and Charles Peirce, and their work is really, really interesting. And Charles Peirce, he wrote about the idea of the fixation of belief, people's belief, why there is this kind of phenomenon of the fixation of belief. And I think that's kind of a really interesting thing to think about in relation to inclusive education, because inclusive education is notably has been hard to achieve. There's been the Salamanca statement dates from 1994, but there's been very kind of slow progress towards inclusive education in many education systems around the world. So it's kind of like, well, why might that be? And I think thinking about this idea of the fixation of belief can help us think about that, why that might be, but it also might help us think about some of these processes, again, that Jonathan was describing this morning. He was kind of describing what processes are important, what practices are important for inclusion, so why they might be important. It might help us to kind of think a little bit more deeply about that. So what Charles Peirce said about fixation of belief, and you have to kind of focus on the bottom of this diagram to begin with. He said that it was a kind of normal human condition to have a kind of tenacity of belief in things. Because if you don't believe in things, you're in this permanent state of discomfort that you don't quite know what is what, and you don't know quite how to proceed. So he argued that actually human beings generally have a sort of certain set of beliefs, and those beliefs they're quite tenacious ones, where people kind of try to keep to that belief to avoid this sort of state of not quite understanding or not quite knowing. But he said that some occasions arise, and you can imagine this in relation to the classroom, where sometimes what you believe about a situation is challenged, that what you actually see happening in the world seems to be contrary to this thing that you believe. And of course, that happens for teachers all the time, that something that they believe about learners or about a learning situation or about a specific learner, actually that what they believe doesn't seem to quite fit what they're actually seeing or what they're actually witnessing. So he said that actually kind of the next stage on from that, when you've got this idea of a kind of contrary belief that contradicts what you believe in, what people tend to do is they tend to seek out some kind of authority that they can appeal to for kind of confirmation of their belief. So that might be a manager in a work type situation. It might be a piece of literature, something that somebody knows from their reading. It might be looking at some kind of information about something, but it generally is something that you go to somewhere that you're familiar with and where you're looking for confirmation of your belief. So there's a kind of issue of confirmation bias at this stage, where you're appealing to an authority, but one that you think is going to confirm what it is that you believe. And that may happen. You may kind of talk to, if it's something in practice, you might talk to somebody that you get on well with at work, and they might say, yeah, Carl, I think you're absolutely right. That it is this case. And you think, well, yeah, so I was right in that belief in the first place. But Charles Peirce said that actually what might happen is that actually you may still be left with this kind of uncomfortable feeling that actually what you think you know doesn't seem to fit what it is that you're actually dealing with, what you've kind of got in front of you. And he said that that was a kind of really, really important stage, because not only is it an uncomfortable position to be in, because you realize that what you believe about something is not quite right, but it also means that you have to formulate new ideas about a situation. You have to think, well, if what I think is not quite right, then what could be right in this situation? And it's a stage of what he calls developing a hypothesis. So what kind of might fit this kind of new situation that I'm trying to think about here. And he says that it leads on to this kind of next level of scientific inquiry, where you actually take steps to acquire new information, to acquire beliefs outside of your own belief system, to then support the development of this new idea and the confirmation of this kind of hypothesis that you might be sort of developing in your mind. And he talks about that as a kind of looking for information that is reliable, information that is valuable, but essentially that is information that is outside of what you know. It's information that's outside of yourself, because actually you're using it to kind of explain something that you didn't originally believe. So I think that this kind of process of movement through different stages of belief is a kind of very interesting one to think about in relation to inclusive education, because when you think about it, that's the situation that practitioners often find themselves in. And I think something that somebody has just mentioned earlier, that, as a teacher, what you tend to do, I mean, I think it's kind of a virtuous part of practice really, is that you tend to kind of teach things and teach in a way that you're familiar with, and you use your kind of prior experiences and prior knowledge and prior resources. You might adapt them a little bit, but you tend to kind of have a kind of reiteration of your practices and belief systems and all the rest of it. But what happens when you teach learners who bring difference to learning situations is that those practices often get challenged, and what you generally do with learners, which generally works out fine, may not work out very well at all for this particular learner, and you might not fully understand why. And that's when you might need to go on this process of either trying to confirm that actually what you are doing is okay, and you just need to do more of it, or actually maybe you need to develop new ideas about your practice, and possibly new ideas about your learner. And so that's where this kind of stage of gathering information. So in this process of change and thinking about the work of Charles Peirce, what research has found is that actually this stage that people get at of gathering information that is outside of what they already know and believe and assume is a really, really important one for inclusive practice. And Mel Ainscough, he writes about this quite a lot, and Kiki Messieu, they're writing some really interesting research in this area. And so they describe practices, and that was something that was considered, I know, in the PebblePad materials as well, that where you can take steps to acquire new information about a situation. So you might make observations, or you might do lesson study. That's something that I know Kiki Messieu is focusing on a lot at the moment. Or you might read about something, and certainly a lot of the initiatives that are going on in Wales at the moment are about teachers as inquirers and research evidence used in practice. You might consult other colleagues, so this idea of a learning community, and also pupil voice, of course, you know, that if you actually ask learners, if you're able to, about kind of their experience, you often acquire information that you actually didn't know, and a perspective that you kind of hadn't really considered. I mean, I think that happens all the time as a teacher of learners who bring difference to learning. And that also you might experiment, so you might try things out, and you might kind of acquire new and different information in that way. So this was actually an activity in the PebblePad, but I thought maybe we could just, I think we've got time, we've got just a few minutes. So I'm going to just give you 5 minutes, because it's a really important kind of area to think about. Just to go back into your breakout rooms for 5 minutes to think about how you gather information. So this kind of information where you're acquiring new information about learning and new information about learners that allows this kind of shift in perspective and development of new ideas. Kind of what are the effective practices in your setting? So we'll just put you into breakout rooms again, if that's okay, Rhiannon, for just 5 minutes. Thank you. So what we're going to do just at the end here, and really thinking now, you know, that obviously, you know, carrying out master studies about thinking critically, isn't it? It's not just kind of taking on board what is, it's actually thinking about it. You know, is it really that, and what else is it? And so actually the professional standards for teaching and leadership, which I've posted in the, I've posted a version of them, which I find really useful. It's all on one Excel spreadsheet. And maybe that's just something sad about me, but I find it useful to have it all on one Excel spreadsheet. So that's posted in the chat here if you wanted to download it. But thinking about the professional standards for teaching and leadership, it is actually kind of interesting thinking about them in relation to lots of different areas, because they cover lots of things and they're really interesting in lots of ways. But there are also things that I think that you can critique about them as well. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and we've only got just over 15 minutes left, so this is kind of like 10 minutes in breakout rooms and then just a final kind of discussion, but is to think about this, what I've been talking about this afternoon. So, you know, the fact that actually change processes in relation to inclusive education are very much about this sort of change in people's belief and a belief in relation to kind of who you're teaching, who you have responsibility for, what they can do and what they're capable of, and also kind of being creative and collaborative in your practice. So those are kind of the key practices. And to think about what does the professional standards say about those things, or does it say something about those things? Are there things that are not there? And so what I'm going to ask you to do, and I guess, should we do the same groups again? Is that what we're doing today? I think it's probably quite nice, isn't it? You've got developed a bit of a relationship now, and in the same groups, just to have a look at the standards, and not really thinking about your own settings now necessarily, but just thinking about the standards and critiquing those in relation to how inclusive are they, how much are they recognizing these important change processes and reflecting those, and how much are they not reflecting that. So sort of, you know, the pros and cons of the professional standards. So I'll give you until about 5 to, so we'll just be right at the end then, and to go back into groups, 10 minutes. This will be our last discussion of the day, in fact. And so if you could do that, Rhiannon, that would be great.